Hello and welcome to Books and Landscape, and the next instalment in the exploration of themes that have come up as a result of my book on the churches, chapels and ruined places of worship across the South Downs National Park, 273 plus of them, and that means that there's a lot of recurring themes that have come in. And today I'm looking at the Reverend Gilbert White and the number of times that he cropped up, and how much it's thrown up about the complexities of his family tree, which came as a bit of a surprise. It's not what, well, almost all of the themes are a surprise. So, yeah, they're just a surprise, aren't they? The Reverend Gilbert White is famous for his book, still in print, The Natural History of Selborne. So obviously the main village associated with the Reverend Gilbert White is Selborne in Hampshire, and it's just south of Alton, and the complexities of his life were that he was born to the son of the vicar of Selborne Church, who was also called the Reverend Gilbert White, in 1720. And his father had been a barrister, but didn't really like doing that. So once he got married, he seemed to spend most of his time making babies. The Reverend Gilbert White Senior had been to Magdalen College, Oxford, which were the patrons for the Selborne Church. The famous Gilbert White, as a result of impact from his uncle Charles White, went to Oriel College, Oxford, and he did become a fellow and various other senior positions in the college during his life, but he was never eligible to be vicar at Selborne, even though that's where he really wanted to be, and that's where he stayed as much as he could. So he took on various curateships across Hampshire and other parts of the country. And that's where his family tree starts to get tangled up in everything that he did. And I got rather confused by his family tree, which is why I'm now talking about it. Because in 1793, as a result of all his siblings having children and their children having children, he counted in his journals 61 nephews and nieces. Now, a lot of these were from the children of his actual nephews and nieces, but 61, that's a big family. So in 1720, he was the first child of his parents. They then had 3 children that didn't make it. And then, well, it doesn't matter whether they made it or not, because poor mummy was putting out a new baby every year. So is there some sort of relationship between somebody who's not got much to do and the number of children he has, or is it just that because there was no family planning in those days, that's what happened? And she died at the age of 47, having given birth to, she had 8 children that survived. So 8 children. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 children survived, 3 died. So that's 11 at least that she hatched, that she was pregnant with. Gilbert White this is famous Gilbert White, was curate of Selborne from 1751, 1756, 1758, and then from 1784 to 1793, which is the date of his death. So long after his death, his great nephew William White, whose father was his brother Francis, was the architect who was in charge of the repairs to the church of 1856, and he also managed to put some yew wood into the church at the same time. Then he was also curate at Farringdon. This is Gilbert again. Was also curate at Farringdon from 1761 to 84. So that's the gap when he wasn't curate at Selborne. In 1757, until his death, he was given the living as another curatorial living. He never did anything other than be curate from Oriel College for Morton Pinkney in Northamptonshire. And he never lived there, and whether he ever went there, I don't know. But his predecessor also had not spent time anywhere near Morton Pinkney. It was something that Oriel seemed to be quite happy about. Early in his career, this is outside the national park, but it turns out to be Northington has been quite a relevant one to have included for a number of reasons, not least because it's in a chalk area, even though it's not in a national park. So Northington Church, the Victorian one, has soaked up the congregation that would have attended the neighbouring Swarton Church, and Gilbert White was the unlicensed curate for his uncle, the Reverend Charles White. And trying to work out the Reverend Charles White got a bit complicated because he was married to Gilbert's aunt, Elizabeth. Elizabeth White was his father's sister, but she was married to the Reverend Charles White, who was the only son of a Charles White, and he was the Reverend at Bradley and was paying to have Gilbert do the curacy in 1747 at Swarton because he was busy at Bradley. The Wakes in Selborne is a very famous property and is the Gilbert White Museum now, and that was bought or potentially built by the Reverend Gilbert White Senior, Gilbert's grandfather, and he lived there as a child with his grandfather. Then his grandfather died, so he went back to his parents, and his parents came to live there. Then at some point it was left by his grandfather to his aunt Elizabeth, who then died, and her husband, the Reverend Charles White, then left the Wakes to Gilbert. It appears that it is likely that Charles White was some sort of relative, but it doesn't look as though he was a first cousin. There was a bit of a tendency for first cousins to marry in those days, and there was another White intermarriage in amongst his nieces and nephews. So he had a niece who was married to her first cousin, so was married to a nephew, and her father-in-law was her uncle. So that they kept that a bit in the family going on. Then at Hawkley, his brother Benjamin's son, the Reverend Edmund White, looked after the earlier chapel from 1788. It was called Mr. White of Newton. It's just... There were loads of them. He had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 aunts and uncles. At Hawkley, there was also the dramatic landslip at Hawkley Hanger that he mentioned in 1774, torn from its place and fell down, leaving a high, free stone cliff, naked and bare, and resembling the steep side of a chalk pit. He didn't like the roads around West Waltham. He didn't like many of the roads, a bit like Cobbett didn't like many of the roads. And in that area, the roads are still quite narrow, and a lot don't seem to go anywhere particularly intentionally. Then at Oakhanger and Blackmore, he mentions the chapels that are now gone, that had been part of Selborne Priory, and so that's in the 18th century they had now gone, and archaeologists still haven't really located where they were. In Ringmer comes Timothy the Tortoise. So his aunt Rebecca Snook lived at Delves House, which is now a retirement home, so the building is still there, or a building is still there. And this was where she lived with her husband and Timothy the Tortoise, with whom Gilbert was transfixed, and there are plenty of entries in his journal that talk about various things to do with Timothy the Tortoise, including trying to see if he would swim, and he didn't, he sank. And looking at his, anyway, so Aunt Rebecca got that from a sea captain in Chichester in 1740. When she died, Gilbert took Timothy, and he in inverted commas, lived for a year after Gilbert, and then after he died, it was discovered that he wasn't a he was a she. So anyway, that's a very confusing ramble. I'm going to try and put up an attempt at something clearer when I put this together. And the next theme was going to be the Civil War, but I think I'm going to leave that for a bit, and I'll do yew trees, I think. So thank you very much for watching. It would be lovely if you could like, and superb if you could comment, particularly if it's a vote for Civil War or yew trees. And all the very best. Thank you.